Before the whisper, my world was made of sunlight and the smell of my dad's workshop. He smelled like sawdust and coffee, a scent that meant safety, that meant I was home. My dad, Daniel, was a giant in my 8-year-old eyes, with hands big enough to fix anything. He could mend my broken dolls with the patience of a saint, build me a treehouse that felt like a castle in the sky, and his laugh was a rumbling thunder that chased away any monsters under my bed. I was his little shadow, trailing him from the garden to the garage, my small hand lost in his. He'd call me his little Mayan, a special name just for me, and when he'd lift me onto his shoulders, I felt like I could touch the clouds. Our house was filled with the evidence of his love: the wobbly bookshelf he made for my room, the tire swing hanging from the old oak tree, the little wooden bird he carved for me that I kept on my nightstand. It was a perfect world, held together by the strength of my father's love. I never had a single reason to doubt it. Not once. The day it happened wasn't marked by a storm or any sign of darkness. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that usually fades into the blur of a happy childhood. The air was warm, and the late afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the living room carpet. My mom, Sarah, was in the kitchen, and the comforting smell of her baking lasagna filled the house. My dad's brother, my Uncle Peter, had come over. They were in the living room, their voices a low, familiar murmur. I wasn't paying much attention. I was on a mission, a very important one. I was trying to teach our cat, Marmalade, how to wear a doll's bonnet. He wasn't a very willing student, and after he wriggled free for the 5th time, the bonnet skittered under the big wing-backed armchair where my dad sometimes sat to read the newspaper. I crawled after it, my world shrinking to the dusty space beneath the chair. It was like a secret cave. The grown-up world was muffled from in here, the legs of the coffee table like ancient trees. I found the bonnet, but just as I started to back out, I heard my uncle's voice, clearer than before. "She's getting so big, Dan. Looks more like you every day." A warmth spread through my chest. I loved when people said I looked like my dad. He was my hero. I stayed quiet, a little smile on my face, enjoying my secret hiding spot. I expected my dad to laugh his big, rumbling laugh. I expected him to say something like, "She's my best girl," or, "She's got my stubborn streak, that's for sure." He said those things all the time, but that's not what he said. The silence that followed my uncle's words stretched for a second too long. The air in my dusty cave suddenly felt cold. Then came the whisper. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. A low, heavy sound, laced with something I had never heard in my father's voice before. It sounded like sadness. It sounded like a secret. "She's not really mine, Pete. You know that." The words didn't make sense. It was like hearing a sentence in a language I didn't understand, but the feeling behind it was universal. It was a punch to my stomach. Not mine. The two words bounced around in the small space under the chair, hitting the walls of my heart. I froze, clutching the tiny doll's bonnet in my hand. From my hiding spot, I could only see his shoes. The sturdy brown work boots, scuffed and worn. The very boots that I would try to slip my tiny feet into, pretending to be him. Those boots had always meant safety, strength, a solid ground to stand on. But now they seemed impossibly far away, standing on a piece of earth that was suddenly crumbling beneath me. My mom's laughter drifted in from the kitchen, a bright, happy sound that didn't belong in my new, dark world. My uncle cleared his throat and said something I couldn't hear. My dad's voice followed, back to its normal volume, talking about baseball, about the weather, about anything but the bomb he had just set off in my 8-year-old soul. I didn't crawl out. I stayed in my dusty cave under the chair for what felt like hours. The smell of sawdust and coffee was gone. All I could smell was the dust and the sudden, suffocating feeling of being a stranger in my own home. I was only 8, but I knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was a moment I would never, ever forget. Crawling out from under the armchair was like emerging into a different world. The living room looked the same. The same familiar couch, the same family photos on the mantel, the same warm light filtering through the window. But it all felt wrong, like a set for a play where I'd forgotten my lines. I could hear my parents and Uncle Peter talking, their voices a low drone that no longer sounded like home. I felt invisible. I crept past the living room entrance, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to get to my room, my own space, which suddenly felt like the only safe place in the universe. I made it upstairs without anyone seeing me. I closed my door, the soft click of the latch echoing the finality of the words I'd heard. The little wooden bird my dad had carved sat on my nightstand, its painted eyes staring at me. I used to think it was watching over me. Now it felt like a spy. Dinner that night was torture. My mom's lasagna, usually my favorite meal, tasted like cardboard. I sat at the table, pushing the food around my plate with my fork. The usual dinner conversation flowed around me. Talk of work, of school, of plans for the weekend. I was silent. "Maya, sweetie, is everything okay?" my mom asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I just shrugged, unable to meet her eyes. I risked a glance at my dad. He was looking at me, a soft smile on his face. "Tired, little Mayan?" he asked. The special name, the one that always made my heart swell, now felt like a lie. It was a sharp poke to a fresh wound. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. How could he sit there and pretend? How could he look at me with such kindness in his eyes when he had just told his brother that I wasn't his? The question was a silent scream in my head. He didn't know I knew. That was the strangest part. He was acting completely normal, which somehow made it all worse. It felt like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. Later, when it was time for bed, he came into my room to tuck me in, just like he did every night. This had always been my favorite part of the day. He'd sit on the edge of my bed and tell me a story, his voice a low, soothing rumble. But tonight, when he leaned over to kiss my forehead, I flinched. It was a small, involuntary movement, but he noticed. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. "What's wrong, Maya?" he asked, his voice gentle. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to shout, "You know what's wrong? You said I wasn't yours." But the words were stuck, trapped behind a wall of fear and confusion. What if he got angry? What if now that I knew the secret, he would stop loving me altogether? The thought was so terrifying that I just shook my head. "Just a bad dream," I mumbled, turning over to face the wall. I felt him hesitate, his hand hovering over my back before he finally rested it lightly on my shoulder. "Okay, little Mayan," he said softly. "Sweet dreams." The weight of his hand felt heavy, foreign. I lay there, rigid, until I heard his footsteps fade down the hall. I didn't sleep for a very long time. The days that followed were a quiet agony. I became a detective in my own home, searching for clues to a mystery I didn't want to solve. I'd stare at my dad for long periods, trying to see what wasn't there. Did I have his eyes? His smile? I'd stand in front of the hallway mirror, pinching my nose, turning my head, trying to find a piece of him in my reflection. I found my mom's wavy brown hair. I found her green eyes, but I couldn't find him. The more I looked, the more I saw a stranger staring back at me. I spent an entire afternoon sitting on the floor of the study, flipping through heavy photo albums. There were pictures of my mom and dad when they were younger, at their wedding, holding me as a baby. In every picture, he was looking at me with that same adoring expression. But the pictures lied. They were props in the play. I felt a cold anger rising in me. Everyone was pretending, and I was the only one who had been left out of the secret. The perfect world he had built for me, the one made of sawdust and safety, had been a beautiful, elaborate lie. And I was living right in the middle of it, a ghost in my own family photograph. The secret became a living thing, a silent passenger that sat between my father and me at all times. It poisoned the simple, joyful moments we used to share. When he'd try to lift me onto his shoulders, I'd make an excuse, saying I was too big now. When he'd ask me to help him in his workshop, I'd say I had homework to do, even when I didn't. Every act of kindness, every loving gesture from him felt like a performance. I started to resent his laughter, the easy way he moved through our home, the way my mom looked at him. I resented their shared world, a world that I now understood I was not fully a part of. The distance between us grew, a chasm I had dug myself, but I didn't know how to bridge it. I was angry at him for the lie, and angry at myself for not being able to pretend along with him. My grades started to slip. My teacher, Mrs. Davison, called my mom to say I was quiet in class, that I wasn't playing with the other kids during recess. I spent most of my time sitting on the swings, pushing myself gently back and forth, lost in a fog of my own thoughts. The other kids' chatter felt distant and unimportant. They were worried about scraped knees and lost toys. I was worried about the foundation of my entire life. How could I explain to them that my dad wasn't my dad? It was a secret too heavy for a playground conversation. So I kept it inside, a hard knot of pain in my chest. My mom tried to talk to me. She'd sit on my bed at night, stroking my hair, asking me what was wrong. "You can tell me anything, Maya," she'd say, her voice full of a gentle concern that only made me feel more guilty. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to tell her everything. But how could I? It was his secret, but she was part of it. Was she lying to me too? Was this whole family a lie? The questions swirled in my mind, making me dizzy. Telling her would mean confronting not just my dad, but the entire structure of my world. It would mean risking the fragile peace of our home, and as much as I hated the lie, the thought of shattering our family was even more terrifying. So I'd just shake my head and blame it on being tired, or a fight with a friend, or anything else I could think of. I was becoming a very good liar. It seemed to run in the family. One Saturday afternoon, a few weeks after I'd heard the whisper, my dad found me in the backyard, sitting in the treehouse he had built. It used to be my castle, but now it felt more like a prison tower. He climbed the wooden ladder, his large frame filling the entrance. "Hey, little Mayan," he said, his voice soft. I didn't answer. I just kept staring out the small window, at the world that no longer felt like mine. He sat down opposite me, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "I miss you," he said quietly. "I feel like you're a million miles away." His words were a direct hit to my heart. I wanted to say, "I miss you too. I miss the dad I thought I had." But instead, I just shrugged. He sighed, a heavy, sad sound that reminded me of the whisper under the chair. "Maya," he said, his voice pleading. "Talk to me. Did I do something? Did I make you angry?" "Yes," I screamed in my head. "You lied to me, every single day." But my mouth wouldn't open. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and traitorous. I quickly wiped it away, hoping he hadn't seen. But he had. He reached out his hand, the big, strong hand that had always fixed everything, and rested it on my knee. "Please, honey," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever it is, we can fix it. I can fix it." And that's when the anger finally boiled over. I slapped his hand away. "No, you can't!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "You can't fix this! You can't fix anything!" I scrambled past him, down the ladder of my broken castle, and ran. I ran past the tire swing, and the wobbly bookshelf, and the little wooden bird. I ran until the burning in my lungs was greater than the burning in my heart, leaving my father sitting alone in the ruins of the world he had built for me. After my outburst, the silence in our house became a suffocating blanket. I didn't run far, just to the end of the street, where I hid behind a thick hedge until my breathing returned to normal. When I finally crept back home, the house was still. I slipped upstairs to my room and stayed there for the rest of the day, ignoring my mom's soft knocks on the door. I heard her and my dad talking downstairs, their voices low and strained. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was one of worry, of a problem they didn't know how to solve. That night, I heard my dad's footsteps pause outside my door, but he didn't come in. He didn't say goodnight. The absence of his voice was a physical ache, a new kind of emptiness that I hadn't expected. I had pushed him away, and a terrifying part of me feared he would simply stay away for good. He didn't, not really, but things were different. He stopped calling me his little Mayan. He became hesitant, cautious, as if I were a fragile object he was afraid of breaking. He'd look at me with a deep, sorrowful question in his eyes, a question he was too afraid to ask, and I was too afraid to answer. Our home, once filled with easy laughter, was now thick with unspoken words. My mom watched us both, her face a mask of anxious confusion. She tried to organize family game nights and movie nights, desperate attempts to stitch us back together, but the efforts felt forced and hollow. We were all playing parts in a tragedy, and the script was falling apart. The final push came from the most unexpected place: school. Mrs. Davison announced our next big project. We were to create a detailed family tree, complete with photos and a short biography of each person. A poster board was handed out to each student. Mine felt like it weighed 100 pounds. This project wasn't just homework. It was a demand for a truth I didn't have. How could I draw a line connecting me to Daniel, my father, when I knew that line was a lie? How could I write a biography about him without the words, "He's not really mine," echoing in my head? I hid the project sheet in the bottom of my backpack, tucked away with old candy wrappers and broken crayons, as if ignoring it would make it disappear. Of course it didn't. A few days later, my mom found it while cleaning my room. "Maya, this looks like a fun project," she said, holding the crumpled sheet. "It's due next week. We should start getting the photos together. We can call Grandma and Grandpa tonight." Her cheerful, practical tone made my stomach clench. "I'll do it later," I mumbled, snatching the paper from her hand. The deadline loomed over me, a ticking clock counting down to my exposure. I had nightmares of standing in front of the class with a blank poster, the empty branches of my family tree a testament to my broken home. The breaking point arrived during a routine checkup at the doctor's office. The nurse was updating our family medical history. Any history of heart disease on the father's side? She asked my mom, her pen poised over the chart. No, none, my mom answered smoothly, without a flicker of hesitation. I was sitting on the crinkly paper of the examination table, and I snuck a look at my dad, who was standing by the window. As my mom answered, I saw his shoulders tighten, just for a second. His gaze was fixed on the street outside, but his jaw was clenched. It was a tiny, almost invisible reaction, but for me, it was a lightning bolt. He was part of this lie, actively. It wasn't just a secret he kept from me. It was a story they told the world. And in that cold, sterile room, I knew I couldn't be a part of it anymore. The fear of breaking our family apart was still there, but it was finally overshadowed by a greater fear. The fear of living my entire life as a stranger to myself. That evening, I took out the big white poster board. I didn't get any photos. I didn't get any markers. I just held the blank sheet, the emptiness of it a perfect reflection of how I felt. With a resolve that came from weeks of silent pain, I walked downstairs. My parents were in the living room, reading. They looked up as I entered, their faces etched with the same weary caution they now always wore around me. I walked to the center of the room and held up the blank poster board. My hands were shaking, but my voice, when it came out, was steady and clear. I can't do my homework, I said, looking directly at my dad, because I don't know who I am. My father stared at the blank poster board in my hands, and the color drained from his face. My mother gasped, looking from me to my dad and back again, a frantic, confused expression in her eyes. Maya, what are you talking about? Of course you know who you are, she began, but her voice faltered when she saw the look on my dad's face. He looked defeated, as if a secret he had carried for years had finally grown too heavy to bear. He slowly got up from his chair and knelt on the floor in front of me so we were at eye level. For the first time in weeks, he didn't seem hesitant or cautious. He just looked incredibly sad. You heard me, didn't you? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. That day, with Uncle Peter, you were in the living room. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. All I could do was nod, the lump in my throat making it impossible to speak. Tears I didn't know I was holding back began to stream down my face. He closed his eyes, and a single tear escaped from his, tracing a path through the faint sawdust that always seemed to be on his skin. Oh, Maya, he breathed. My little Mayan, I am so sorry. We never wanted you to find out that way. We never wanted to hurt you. My mom was crying now, too, her hands over her mouth. She knelt beside my dad, creating a small broken circle on the living room floor. We were going to tell you, she said, her voice choked with tears. When you were older, when you could understand. Understand what? I finally managed to ask, my voice small and trembling. Understand that you're not my dad? My father's eyes snapped open, and he shook his head fiercely. He took my hands, his large, warm grip enveloping mine. No, Maya, that's not it. That's not the truth. I am your dad. I may not have given you my eyes or my hair, but I have given you every single piece of my heart. That will never, ever be a lie. He took a deep, shaky breath. Before I met your mom, she was in love with someone else, a man named Thomas. He was my best friend. When your mom found out she was pregnant with you, he got scared. He wasn't ready to be a father, and he left. He just disappeared. He looked at my mom, his eyes full of a shared history of pain. I had always loved your mom, he continued, turning his gaze back to me. And when she told me she was going to have you, I knew I wanted to be there for both of you. When you were born, the doctors put you in my arms, and you were this tiny, perfect little thing. You grabbed my finger, and you just held on. And in that moment, Maya, none of the rest of it mattered. You weren't his. You weren't mine. You were ours. You were my daughter. That was the only truth that mattered. Then why? I whispered, the anger replaced by a deep, aching confusion. Why did you say you're not mine? Because sometimes, he said, his voice thick with regret. Grown-ups have moments of sadness for things that can never be. When your Uncle Peter said you looked like me, it just hurt. It was a stupid, selfish flicker of pain that you look like a man who didn't have the courage to love you. It was a whisper about my own hurt, Maya, never, ever about my love for you. Being your dad is the proudest, most important thing in my life. The words were wrong, and they were never meant for you to hear. My love, my real love, is in the treehouse, and the stories, and every single day we've had together. The secret, the monster that had been living in the shadows, was finally out. And it wasn't a monster at all. It was just sad. The fortress of anger I had built around my heart began to crumble, brick by brick. The sawdust and coffee smell, the rumbling laugh, the hands that could fix anything, they weren't a lie. They were a choice. He had chosen me. He chose to be my dad every single day. I looked at the man kneeling in front of me, his face stained with tears, and I saw a love more powerful than I had ever understood. It wasn't a love that was required by blood, but a love that was given freely and with his whole heart. I dropped the poster board, and for the first time in weeks, I wrapped my arms around his neck and held on tight. He hugged me back with a force that took my breath away, burying his face in my hair. "I love you, Dad," I sobbed into his shoulder. And for the first time, I understood what those words really meant. Later that week, I finished my family tree. I drew a thick, strong line connecting me to my mom, and another one connecting me to my dad. Then, with a pencil, I drew a faint, dotted line to a name without a picture. Thomas. It was a part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. My real story was about a man who built me a castle in the sky, who smelled like sawdust and coffee, and who taught me that family isn't just about where you come from. It's about the people who choose to love you and never, ever let you go. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a message of hope.